Mexico, because if we don't, you know, like it's going to collapse our economy too, right? So that's why the US gave Mexico a lot of money to help it come out of the recession. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right. And then at the end, the impact is that, like, oh, without like NAFTA and US help and blah, 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 you know, Argentina, like it could have been like an Argentina like peso crisis. And peso is just like the Mexican dollar, right? It's just what they call their currency. And basically, like in Argentina, poverty doubled because of their recession, right? So basically, without the US, you know, Mexico's poverty probably would have doubled as well. So, um, what did you write down on your sheet? Can you like perhaps like turn on your camera and like just hold your paper up to the camera so I can just look at it for a second? Or you can read it to me if you don't want to open your camera or take a picture and send it in the chat.
See, but it looks like this if you see it. Like,
I see. Okay. So you wrote China, China bad. Uh-huh. Can you hold it a little bit higher? Yeah. And then okay, so you have yeah, those are really good things. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let me show you mine, right? If we look at mine, okay. I hate the way this has to work. I wish I could take a picture, but that's gonna take too long. So if you look at the top, right, I scribbled something out, but C1 is future, because he was like, okay, we have to consider this about how NAFTA will impact the future and also the past, right? So my contention one I wrote for his name was future. And then first, what you can see right here is that like Trump turns away our allies right now, but like NAFTA is really good for economies and stuff, right? And then he talks about like, oh, NAFTA is so great for the economy, but once like we leave, that means, you know, China's gonna fill in, right? So as you can see right here, no NAFTA equals China fill in, right? My handwriting is kind of bad, but then, you know, that means Chinese influence is bad because they have like bad human rights, right? And then if you go down here, this is my contention too about the past, right? And then this is everything we talked about. The first point is on exports, you know, how NAFTA saved Mexico's exports. The second point is on investor confidence, right here. And then the third point right here is the US bailout. And then the impact is at the bottom right. So basically what I did was I kind of numbered the big ideas. I wrote C1 for each contention. And then let me give you, so like, if you look right here, I wrote like, right here, right? I wrote Brookings 97, and then I wrote like, what is this? Brookings 97 encourage FDI, right? So, and then I put like a box next to Brookings, and that just basically is the card name. So we call evidence cards, right? So like the evidence name, the Brookings is, you know, the institution where it came from. It could be the author's last name, and then 97 is the last two digits of the year, right? So for example, if I had an article from Washington Post in 2020, I'd write like Washington, like WA Post 20, right? I wouldn't write 2020 because it's probably not from 1920. So when you're flowing, you want to make sure for the case, you know, you want to make sure that you have the contention, big ideas, and then some of the important card names, right? Because later when you refer to their evidence, the judge will be like, oh yeah, I remember that piece of evidence. So I can go back and look at that. All right, now let's listen to the neg speech. Oh, I keep forgetting to share audio, sorry. Let's do that again.
you do neg with the other color, right?
Yes, with the other color, exactly. And then neg, it's gonna be on the other sheet of paper. So you want the AF case on one sheet of paper and then the neg case on another. Right, let's get started.
Bailout for the US. Did he ever outbreak of a global reflected a disastrous economic downfall?
Okay, well, apparently the neg case was supposed to go first, but I kind of just skipped over it, but it's okay. It doesn't really matter which case, where the constructives go. So let's listen to his constructive.
1960 to 80, Mexico's GDP. I have to thank my partner, Devet. I know this is a lot. You've always been forcing me to rely that this. That was a lot, so let's get to it.
Okay.
For the last time ever, Devesh and I negate the resolution. Our sole contention is halting Mexico's development. Prior to NAFTA, Mexico was on a path to sustainable long-term development, as Mark Wiesbro, director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research 14 explains. Mexico's program of planned industrial development, domestic enterprise, and rigid social programs brought record levels of growth in the years before NAFTA. From 1960 to 80, Mexico's GDP per capita doubled, amounting to huge increases in living standards for the vast majority of Mexicans. If the country had continued to grow at this rate, as nations like South Korea did, it would be living in European standards today. Simultaneously, Mexico used a gradual approach to open itself to the world market while protecting national industries. As Cordova Brookings 03 explains, following the 1982 debt crisis, Mexico began gradually liberalizing its economy, eventually eliminating trade licenses and simplifying tariffs. During this period, the Library of Congress finds that Mexico diversified its exports, moved towards self-sufficiency in food and most consumer goods, and expanded domestic production. Unfortunately, NAFTA brought this development to a halt, plunging Mexico into the global economy headfirst with no regulation or protection of domestic industry. As Wiesper writes, NAFTA brought Mexico's industrial and developmental policies to an end, enshrining rapidly deregulated trade and investment in a binding agreement. Specifically, Rocha of the Institute for Policy Studies 14 writes that under NAFTA, corporations were granted the legal power to sue the Mexican government whenever it passed programs that could interfere with corporate profits. This resulted in a chilling effect where the Mexican government was effectively blackmailed out of passing further reforms that served the public interest. Instead, NAFTA reversed progress and electrocuted the Mexican economy in two ways. The first is destroying domestic industry. Without any domestic regulation, NAFTA's rapid shift to trade allowed American multinational corporations to quickly take over Mexico's key industries, destroying jobs for the poor and working class. As Rocha writes, NAFTA has unequivocally been a net job destroyer for Mexico, as companies like Walmart have displaced scores of smaller businesses, causing more than 600,000 companies to go bankrupt during the current administration alone. For example, in the agricultural sector, Wiesbro finds roughly 5 million permanent farm jobs were lost due to agricultural monopolies. Thus, he concludes the Mexican unemployment rate has averaged roughly 5% under NAFTA, whereas in the pre-NAFTA age, it was only 3%. Second is creating financial dependency. As Wiesbro explains, because Mexican institutions were still developing when NAFTA was enacted, the deal increasingly tied the country to American investment, meaning any recession would hit Mexico harder, as the US would pull all its money out of the market. Indeed, financial crises in 94, 01, and 08 all had a more severe impact on Mexico than any other country in the region. Reuters 17 verifies that Mexican dependence on America's economy pushed an additional 5 million people into poverty during the 08 recession alone. Worst of all, this dependence means that shocks in the prices of basic goods, which used to be stable, are now highly volatile. Laura Carlson of New York Times 17 finds that under NAFTA, Mexican consumers now pay more for food in general, while price spikes on the international market have pushed millions of the poor into starvation. For these two reasons, Professor Danny Roderick of Harvard University 17 concludes, almost all of the world's developing country success stories, China, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, avoided rapid globalization and instead used a gradual approach to liberalization, with the government playing an active role in restructuring the economy and buffering it against volatile markets. Wiesbro furthers that since 2000, Mexico's economy has grown at less than half the rate as the rest of Latin America. While most of its countries have implemented developmental policies that cut the overall rate of poverty in Latin America by 1/3, Mexico has made no progress whatsoever. In other words, given Mexico's roughly 60 million people under the poverty line, NAFTA prevented the country from lifting tens of millions of people into the middle class. It's for these reasons that we strongly negate the resolution. Thank you.
Right, so that was the case. Do you have any questions about any part of it?
Not really.
Not really? Okay, so it all makes sense. Okay, can you show me what you got again this time? Okay, so Mexico, NAFTA stopped Mexico from, yeah. Blackmailed, destroyed Mexico. Beautiful. Okay. Yeah, all of that looks really good. Yeah, you're doing a great job. Perfect. All right. Okay, so I think we can just continue watching this. So the next speech is going to be Crossfire. And the first cross usually sets the mood for things. So we'll see.
never get how you write the crossfire and the flowing.
Oh, you don't flow Crossfire.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But like maybe like let's say they're like, yeah, we concede. You should just vote for the opponents, right? Like you can like write that on a sticky note or something, or like they made like a really big concession, like, oh yeah, okay, we will like our first contention is wrong, or like all our arguments are wrong, right? You can bring that up later in your speech, but you don't have to flow it, right? So we're just gonna watch Crossfire to understand how it works, but you don't have to flow any of this, so you don't have to like write anything.
Yep.
So in 1995, when Bill Clinton proposed the bailout for the U.S., did he ever use the word NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, or anything similar?
It doesn't matter what the semantics are, right? We say that because
really?
of the
'Cause that's
close
your
linkages.
case.
No. It doesn't matter what the president says, right? Because they say things that they don't necessarily are
Okay,
doing.
so
right,
the administration.
the things in mind, right? Our evidence says that because of the close linkages that were
Yeah.
only forged because of NAFTA,
Okay.
if Mexico,
Yeah,
can you please let me know?
I understand what your evidence says.
If
My
Mexico
question-
slid under because of the close linkages forged by NAFTA, the U.S. would have suffered the same economic crisis
So
they didn't want to.
I
Can I ask you a
understand.
question?
No, this is really important because you dodged what I was trying to say, right? So I understand
No.
what your evidence talks about when they are analyzing what you wanted to say. But if you look at what the administration went out and said, the only
They didn't have my argument
Okay,
in
the
mind. They
only
wrote
thing
it
the White
20
House
years
said,
ago.
if
Can
you
I ask
look
you
to
a question?
reality, the only thing the White House said was that they wanted to prevent illegal aliens from spilling up across the border, and they wanted to prevent a global crisis.
Yes,
If your
a
impact
global
is so
crisis
big-
that would have only
Yes.
started because of the close linkages
Yes.
forged by NAFTA.
Okay,
That
so
is
that's
what
perfect.
the evidence
That's
says.
perfect.
If you're just coming up here and just like saying some
The
random.
bigger
Can I
your
ask you a
impact
question?
is, the more reason the U.S. has to give the bailout. If a global crisis is going to happen, or if other countries are going to be affected, then NAFTA doesn't matter
No.
because the U.S. has an inherent reason to stop that from
The
happening.
reason why the global economic crisis would have happened
It's
is
not
the
because of
only
NAFTA.
reason is because of NAFTA,
That's
right?
so naive.
No.
Like
the United
before
States
that-
was
okay.
not closely linked
Sure.
to Mexico as much as it
Yeah.
was post
Okay, so
NAFTA.
if that's
Can
true,
I please ask
okay,
a question?
one last thing.
No,
If that's true,
You've had three
why did the
things.
U.S. bail out
It's like half
Mexico
of Crossfire.
in 1982 when we did not have NAFTA?
It took them a lot longer to bail them out, and also the recovery because of that, because of the lack of investment and the lack of exports, also
But-
took a lot longer, right? The recovery in
Okay, so you're
1982 took
Okay, sure.
tons of years,
So
and
the-
in
so the
1995
bailout doesn't
it only
trigger
took
your
1
offense,
year.
only
Can
the
I
FDI
please-
does.
Can I please have
Yeah,
one
sure.
question? Okay, cool. So you say that 600 companies went bankrupt during the last administration.
600,000.
Yeah, so the American evidence that gets that number, when it looks to the actual article that was posted in Mexico, why does it say that the 600,000 companies went out of?
If you don't
went
like
out
that
of
evidence, I can read another piece of
No,
evidence.
but why did those 600,000 specifically go
I would
bankrupt?
rather just engage with a warrant than like talk about useless numbers, right? Like
Okay,
I
but
personally
if-
don't know the answer to
If
that.
your impact is only about those useless numbers, then
No,
how are you
like
gaining
if you
an
don't like
impact
that
now?
number, I can read another one. I personally don't know the answer to your question. Maybe you do. But
Yeah,
like,
so it
I
says
don't know
that
why
the
it matters.
administration would refuse to give tax credits to these companies, so they had to go under. It wasn't
Okay.
at all attributable to NAFTA. You can have a question.
Sure. So when you talk about how we have to look at towards things that would happen if we pulled out right now, let's say the resolution was the consequences of being inside high school, or the benefits outweigh the consequences of being in high school. Would I have to defend dropping out of high school right now, or never going to high school in the first place?
No, yeah, you would have to defend the continued participation of you being in high school, because those benefits only come with you being in high school.
Okay, so as long as I was in high school, but
No.
why would I have to
If
like?
you
Would I
can-
have to drop out?
It's overtime.
Okay.
So, yeah, what's your first impression of the first cross you've ever watched? Not too spicy, huh? Yeah, Crossfire is always a shit show, but sometimes they're pretty good. Do you have any like questions about what they said?
No, not really.
Okay, then we'll just keep going. So next is going to be the neg rebuttal. So where you're going to want to flow it is on Aft's case, right? So right next to Aft's case, like if they made an argument against, you know, contention 1, just write it next to contention 1. If it's next to contention 2, write it next to contention 2, right? And make sure you're doing this with your neg colored pen.
Critics out of the way and picks people who are where I found a lot of my work. That's incredible. I've never seen a number. The thesis of our case is that while trade might be a good idea, equal rules for unequal players create unequal outcomes. Our argument is that when the US entered into NAFTA, when US entered into NAFTA, Mexico was gradually liberalizing its economy already, opening itself up to the world economy. But NAFTA took away all of the regulations and sped up the pace of trade so that Mexico could not acclimate to the trade that was already happening, causing their economy to go into free fall and destroying the livelihoods of the poor in the country. Let's talk about their framework. They tell you that we should look at continued participation and the impacts of participation in the past. But as Ishan points out in Crossfire, if the resolution was the benefits of a college education outweigh the harms, we shouldn't be saying that a current college-educated student should drop out. It's that they never should have gone to college. That's why the resolution doesn't use the word continued, for example, which is why we should look to what a world where Mexico never went into NAFTA really looks like. Let's deal with their first contention. They tell you that if Trump pulled out of NAFTA, bad things would happen. We say two things. First, we say that, again, this isn't topical because we're talking about a world where the US did not sign on to NAFTA and we stayed with the gradual increase in trade that was happening beforehand. But the second big problem with this argument is that it misses the mark on Trump's current policy. According to The Hill in 2017, Trump actually wants to renegotiate NAFTA at best. He's not going to pull out because there's far too much pressure in the government. So you're never going to be seeing this scenario materialize, which just means we should focus on the far more probable scenario where the US never signed on to NAFTA and we saw Mexico gradually developing. Let's deal with their second contention about the benefits of NAFTA. They talk about this 94 recession that was prevented by NAFTA, and they give you three reasons why. The first reason they give you is that trade increased as a consequence of NAFTA. But according to Professor Maurer of Harvard University in 2016, economists are largely in agreement that with or without NAFTA, Mexico and the US would have the same amount of trade virtually today, because Mexico was already opening itself up to the world economy and lowering tariffs. The difference is that A, that trade increase would have happened a lot more gradually, so Mexico could build itself up. But B, it would have had regulation, so America couldn't buy up Mexican land, speculate on their markets, and push the poor into starvation and poverty. Then there's second warrant here. They talk about how foreign investments cushion the impact of this recession. But this argument is ahistoric because even before NAFTA, Nguyen of the University of Houston finds that from 1982 to 1993, that decade, Mexico was already #1 in Latin America in terms of development. Because what they lacked in foreign investment, they had in domestic investment and domestic enterprise. But NAFTA stripped that away from them, which on net pushed them to where today they are 18th out of 20 in Latin America. You can see that they've fallen off. But the second overall response to this comes from the Center for Policy Studies in 2015, which finds that there was an increase in FDI, but there was a 5 times increase in volatile investment after NAFTA. This is things that went into speculating on their stocks and buying up their land, which actually increased the odds of a recession. That's why every recession, 94, 01, 08, all hit Mexico harder than the rest of Latin America, which used the gradual path. Finally, they talk about how the US bailed Mexico out, but there are two problems with this. The first of which is that they can predict somehow that this recession would have led to a global crisis, then by that same logic, America has an interest in preventing a global crisis. They're going to come up and say that it only would have led to a global crisis under NAFTA, but then that's the reason to not have NAFTA, so we never risk a global crisis. But the second overall response to this is that the reason Clinton bailed them out is because they were south of the border. That's what he said. We're going to bail out countries that are nearby because we don't want illegal immigrants fleeing there. That's why, for example, America didn't bail out Chile, even though we did have a free trade agreement with them, but we did bail out Mexico in '82 when we didn't have a free trade agreement with them. Finally, the reason you turn this argument against their side is because Neely of Harvard University finds in 1997 that the reason this recession started in the first place is because NAFTA made Mexico dependent on United States investment. Then, 1 year later, when political events occurred in Mexico, they were able to pull all that money out of the market, dropping the peso's value by 50%. But without NAFTA, that dependency wouldn't exist. They further that if NAFTA didn't exist, Mexico could have stopped the recession without American bailouts on its own. Thus, we're very proud to negate.
All right. So, did you have any questions about any of the arguments he made?
It was kind of confusing, but not really.
Not really. Okay. So, here, let me just go over what I thought that I got down. So, the first at the top, he was like, we can't consider future impacts, right? Basically what he's arguing is that instead of looking at it as like what would happen if we were to drop out now, we have to look at it as what would happen if we never got into it in the first place, which means this Chinese problem wouldn't even have happened, right? Because we would have never been in NAFTA. And then the arguments that he made when he says non-topical, right? The first response he makes to the first contention about like Trump is that it's non-topical, which just basically means we can't consider it under the topic, right? Because sometimes people will run like the weirdest impacts. Like let's say you're debating like a medical contention, right? And then they bring up like, oh yeah, and then I don't even know. They're gonna say something like, and they're just gonna like run something entirely not related to the resolution. They're just gonna be like, oh yeah, we're going to, like let's say you're like, oh, we should nationalize healthcare, and then they suddenly bring up a contention about like, yeah, we're gonna destroy all pharmaceutical companies, right? Like that's obviously non-topical because that's not what the resolution is talking about. It's talking about nationalizing healthcare. It's not talking about like killing off every single American drug company, right? So that's what non-topical means. And then his second response was from the Hill 17 card, right? Which just said that Trump wants to renegotiate NAFTA. He's not going to like back out. He's just going to be like, oh, Mexico, next time you have to give us more money for this or something, right? On the second contention, the first response on the first link for exports, right? He cites this Harvard 16 card that says with or without NAFTA, Mexico would still have had a lot of trade. So like NAFTA didn't really increase exports. It was like happening already anyways. And then second on investor confidence, he said from Nguyen that Mexico was #1 in domestic investment. So basically he's making the argument here that like you don't need FDI or, you know, foreign direct investment because you have so much domestic investment. But when the US came in with NAFTA, that's when Mexico increased its reliance on foreign direct investment. And the reason that was bad was because the kinds of foreign direct investment that NAFTA was, you know, encouraging was like risky ones, like, oh, I'm gonna like, I don't know, like really sus, like, you know, stock exchanges, which obviously made a recession a lot likelier. And then on the third point of US bailout, the first response was that US would have prevented the global crisis, right? Anyway, so he's basically saying like, if my opponents can predict that it would have led to a global crisis, and, you know, obviously America doesn't want like a global recession because that's bad for everyone, they would have prevented it with or without NAFTA, right? But then he also made this like really smart remark. He was like, okay, and then they're saying, right, what the pro is saying is that like, oh, you know, it's because of NAFTA that it would have led to a global recession, right? And then he's saying, okay, if it really is because of NAFTA that this Mexico recession would have turned into a worldwide recession, then we might as well not have had NAFTA at all, right? Which is a good point. And then the second point he puts on this bailout is that we bailed them out because we hate immigrants, not because we want to help Mexico or because of NAFTA, because we had a trade agreement with Chile, but we didn't bail them out, right? We only bailed out Mexico because they're so close to us that if everyone there went in poverty, they just like jump over the wall and, you know, I mean, there wasn't a wall back then. They'd just swim across the river and come to America, and Bill Clinton hated that. And then the third response was this Neely 17 card that says NAFTA is the root cause of this Mexico recession because of US dependency. So basically, if NAFTA wasn't there, this recession wouldn't really have even happened and Mexico could have recovered. So that's just the rundown. Now, the next speech is going to be the AF rebuttal. And so they're probably going to go defend their case, so they're going to frontline and then the opponent's case. I'm not sure, but just whatever you hear, you know, flow it to each side. So if they go on their case first, flow it on the F's, like the next rebuttals, you know, just write it next there. Or if they're going across the neg case, just apply it to the neg rebuttals. Start.
For the top happen, and I will never. Systems are made up of people, and that individual behaviors comprise the larger Their arguments are true that in Mexico, booms, it had the ability to develop. Girls watching, believe in yourself. To everyone else, things are changing, and it starts with you. So in the.
Okay, great inspirational speech. Now we will actually start.
So when everyone's ready, it'll start on their case.
So,
Our second contention will be the first thing you evaluate in this round. This is because prolonging a recession precludes the ability for a country to gradually develop independently. Even if their arguments are true that in Mexico, booms, it had the ability to develop, it doesn't mean that in bust they can still develop. This is because public spending and investment shrink during recessions and make spending towards development virtually non-existent, which is why in Argentina, which experienced a peso crisis, but no because it did not have linkages to the US like Mexico had with NAFTA, it experienced incredibly volatile and near zero growth, comparatively lower than that of Mexico's. Start on their first contention. Their narrative is both counterintuitive and counterfactual. Their Wisebro evidence says that Mexico was experiencing record levels of growth. It was in 1960 to 80, before NAFTA and before liberalization started. But even that was seriously unsustainable. This is important because it proves that NAFTA was not the main reason for Mexico's slowing of growth. It was a necessary move away from protectionism or the gradualism that they talk about. Then they say that Mexico experienced record levels of growth. But in his book about NAFTA, Orme of UT writes that GDP growth seen in the 90s would have been difficult to sustain absent NAFTA. This is because Salinas needed the efforts to lock in the momentum of liberalization because he faced significant opposition. Specifically, he finds that it would have been far more difficult for a future Mexican government to pursue economic integration had NAFTA been rejected. Then they talk about ISDS and corporations causing a chilling effect. But Gertz 18 of Brookings finds that in light of the current impasse, there's a real possibility that NAFTA's investment rules will be scrapped into NAFTA 2.0, either by parties formally agreeing to exclude the stipulation altogether or by including an opt-out clause that all countries would take, meaning that in either case, this warrant would no longer apply. Then on the impact level, they tell you 600,000 companies went bankrupt, but Milenio finds that this was due to a lack of small business credits in Mexico, which the Nieto administration ended up reinstating. But then they tell you that people were displaced in the agricultural sector. Lederman finds that NAFTA actually included stipulations which would have allowed Mexico to put in place tariffs to prevent this from happening, but they just chose not to do so, which means that this problem is a fault of Mexican government, the Mexican government failing, not a fault of American participation within NAFTA. But even so, we would say this is an on-net benefit. This is because they're implicitly conceding that food prices in Mexico have decreased. This is the case because Mexican farmers, if Mexican farmers are losing their jobs, it means they can no longer profitably work. This necessarily means that prices have gone down because there's no way these farmers would be out of work if they could sell their produce at the same price as American farmers. We therefore outweigh in two ways. First, on scope. Price reductions massively benefit our larger section of the Mexican population, but second on magnitude, price reductions help those in poverty. Even if wages haven't increased, lower wages still means that every dollar gets stretched farther. Yes, farmers might be unemployed as well, but we say that lower prices benefit those in poverty and unemployed across Mexico. Lastly, when they talk about the severity of recessions and the frequency of recessions, we would say that the frequency and severity of recessions is about the same as it was before. That's because Caro finds that actually having the NAFTA, because it increased investor confidence in terms of a long-term trade relationship with Mexico, decreased volatility of the Mexican economy by 40%, so their argument is empirically false. But second, I would say the reason why Mexico was hit the hardest is because it's one of the most trade liberalized countries in the world. Mexico has free trade agreements with 46 countries, and only one of those is the United States, meaning that they would have been hit really hard by recessions even in the absence of NAFTA, and they had strong ties to the U.S. even before NAFTA, so they would still be hit by domestic downturn within the United States. Then they tell you that economic downturn and poverty reduction is a lot slower in Mexico than it is in the rest of Latin America. We say that this happened because Mexico experienced the peso crisis, but we say two things. Number one, the peso crisis would have spilled over to the rest of Latin America had the U.S. not bailed them out, and number two, growth would have been a lot worse in Mexico had they not seen the bailout. None on our case. First, he tells you that the bailout did not happen because of NAFTA, but this is not true. Blecker claims that NAFTA forced Mexico to devalue the peso, but Mexico would have had to devalue it anyway. This is because they pegged the value of the peso to the American dollar in 1988 before NAFTA talks even started, and then experienced political violence in 1994 that caused investors to flee the region out of fear. Because the value of the peso was pegged, it was overvalued compared to what investors saw, which means the devaluation would have happened in either world, not linked to NAFTA, but NAFTA was the only way in which we saw a solution.
all right, that must have been confusing. Do you have any questions about specific parts?
Well, like, I was like really confused, but like I got the general idea.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, just making sure you're writing down words on the page. Like even if you have no idea what you're doing in a round, at least if you write down the words that they said, you can maybe understand it later in the round, like when they're explaining Crossfire. I think maybe one of the confusing things might have been like the stuff that she was saying at the top, right? It wasn't really a response, it was more like a weighing. So we talked about weighing, how it's important to compare, like, okay, even if I just win my case, I win the entire round, right? She talked about how it's more important. She says how if she won her second contention, it basically takes out their entire case. And the reason why is because if NAFTA didn't bail them out, then Mexico couldn't have climbed out because they wouldn't have had the money to do so, right? And then on their case, the only really defense that they made was that this Mexico crisis was caused by Mexico itself, not really NAFTA. All right, so now we will listen to Cross. And after we're listening to Cross, I'll let you go, but make sure you keep your flow. So next week, we're gonna continue doing this.
You ready? Let's go. Let's start time now. Okay, so you talk about how the peso crisis would have spilled over to the rest of.
Right.
So doesn't America have an interest in preventing a global recession either way?
So we would say that the reason they would not have, I would say that of course the US has an interest in preventing a global recession, but I would say that they empirically have not stepped in to intervene in countries that they did not have dense trade ties with.
Okay.
Like Argentina when they experienced it.
So let's talk about that though, right? Because in 1982, when Mexico was south of their border, they did. But really what I was about to ask you about, right, is in first Crossfire, Chris told Ishan that the reason they wouldn't have is because there was no risk of a global recession without NAFTA. So why are you trying to solve a problem that NAFTA created?
So we would say that there definitely would have been a risk of a global recession absent NAFTA.
So then you disagree with what Chris said in first Crossfire?
No, we would say no. I think you're misunderstanding our argument. Our argument is that if the peso crisis had not been, if like the Mexico had not been bailed out during the peso crisis, there would have been a global economic crisis. I do not think that that is the case with other countries that have been in recession because they do not have the same number of like economic linkages that Mexico does to the rest.
We'll get back to this in a second, but I think it's your turn for your question.
Sure. So when you talk about the fact that volatility increased in Mexico after NAFTA, why is that the case?
Volatility increased?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're doing comparative analysis. So you talk about how in Mexico volatility dropped by 40%. Ishan's gonna come up here and tell you that we agree, because most countries that open up to trade gradually see reductions in volatility, but the rest of Latin America saw far greater reductions in volatility than Mexico, which is why all of the recessions were worse for Mexico than them.
I would say that, number one, the reason why Mexico experiences worse recessions than the rest of Latin America is because it's so liberalized. It has free trade agreements with so many countries. So of course it will be impacted more frequently and severely. But specifically the dense linkages to the US forged by NAFTA are the uniqueness for our case.
So our argument is that while all of the countries in Latin America are highly liberalized, NAFTA is what uniquely took away the regulations on that liberalization, which is why it's worse. But can I have a question?
Go ahead.
You talk about how if they didn't bail them out, they would go like Argentina, and poverty in Argentina doubled, right? So Argentina and Brazil both saw worse recessions, and both of them were not bailed out, and we agree that these things happen. But in the long term, through gradual liberalization, what happened to those countries relative to Mexico?
So the problem is that we would say that gradual liberalization would not have been a sustainable possibility for Mexico.
We understand that response, but I'm talking particularly about if we won that point, what did happen to Argentina and Brazil without an American bailout?
I'm not going to entertain that because I don't think that that point has like a valid premise in the round. So I would say,
I mean, we think it does, which is why I asked.
Well, I mean, once you if you win that argument and properly respond to the responses I put on your case,
the correct answer
then we can weigh
is
that
that they outperformed Mexico by a factor of 2 and cut poverty by a third.
So I would say that the reason why that happened was because they were not affected by the tequila crisis, specifically because the U.S. bailed them out and that crisis didn't spread to the rest of Latin America.
Argentina was not bailed out.
All right. Discussing crossfires, my least favorite part. Next week we'll just continue going over this, and I'll do a better breakdown of all of this. Hopefully William will be here too. So you're free to go.
Okay, thank you.
Bye. Ishan, can you stop the recording? Oh, okay. Ishan?
Yeah, sure. Just give me